Hello everyone, my name is Martin Binfield, and I'm here today to talk to you about space switching, a new approach to character rigging. So this is me. I've got more than 20 years experience in the games industry, working for big studios and small, remotely and in offices. I started at Sony Cambridge straight from university, but I wasn't specialised at the time, hence I did a bit of everything: environment art, character modelling, animation, cutscene direction, mocap direction and so on. Over the years I specialised into animation. When I moved to Australia in 2018, I went freelance and I started working on my own game, learning to code C# as I went. Here's a few of the games that I've worked on. There are some realistic animation projects like Heavenly Sword, Ghost Hunter and Frozen Cortex, and there are some cartoony animation projects like Little Big Planet, Medieval and Roki. This is the game that I've been working on in my spare time. Schrodinger's Cat Burglar is a puzzle stealth adventure starring a cat that can be in two places at once. This is footage from the prototype I put together last year, entering and winning Equus's Quantum Games competition. I want to stress the art and specifically animation you see in this video is not what today's talk is about. This will give you some idea of where I came from and where I am now. So, in normal circumstances, I use Rapid Rig Modular for character animation. I can recommend this. It's inexpensive, configurable and effective. I haven't investigated M-Gear for myself, but I hear that that's also great. Basically, there are many rigging solutions out there that work well. But for Schrodinger's Cat Burglar, I found that this approach wasn't what I wanted. I decided to get stuck in and make my own rigging scripts. The rig in itself isn't special, but how the rig is created is where the magic happens. It was watching this talk by Richard Lico that blew my mind. He's the animator on a VR game called Moss, and he detailed his approach to animating the main character Quill. His approach to rigging was a rejection of the current rigging paradigms, and seeing his workflow in the talk and how freeing it was left me enamoured. Here's the summary of the talk. This does not do it justice whatsoever, but it's important to get an idea of the framework. The main aspects of the approach are that the rig isn't stored. It's created each time the animation work is required. The rig builds on top of baked animation and uses Mayer's animation layers to affect the existing data. Of course, it also is used to create animations from scratch. What this allows is for the rig to be created in whatever style the animator needs right at that moment. No switching between IK and FK controls, just bake the animation and rebuild the rig. Richard even goes as far as keeping the animation data in FBX files only, not Maya files. This allows changes in Unreal Engine to persist when the animations are reworked. There's mention of aim space in here to tweak internal posing. That is the exciting stuff, which I'll cover soon. How this is accomplished is with lots of simple scripting. Richard self-confessedly doesn't know Python, so he makes everything in Maya's proprietary scripting language, Mel. This is true for me too. Mel isn't powerful, but it works. A key factor in this approach is to have one-to-one mapping of controllers to joints, meaning things like foot roll channel on the leg controllers is not allowed. The use of animation layering and even physics simulation to speed up the process all factors in to make the approach extremely fast and user-friendly. You can learn more about this from Richard's GDC talk and can go even deeper into the techniques with his training at Animation Sherpa. What I'll detail today is my approach, how I built my own scripts from the information in Richard's GDC video. I started small, just getting bits up and running. The scripting is definitely a time investment, but it's not a quick process, but it's worth it. I tweaked the cat model a number of times and rolled in some driven controls for skinning helper joints. Similarly, I put in a solution for eye look and pupil dilation that aren't one-to-one with the joints, so I broke the paradigm a bit there. And I use LM Spring 2 for some light physics simulation. Again, I can recommend this. It's inexpensive and effective. So let's take a look at Mittens, the star of the game. Starting on the left with a model from the prototype for a different game. I hadn't modelled characters for a long time, but decided to just get stuck in. You can see that it took a few iterations for me to home in on a look for Mittens, and to blow the cobwebs off my modelling skills. One in from the right is the model from the prototype last year, and after that, the last model in this list is beginning to get closer to natural proportions, but with a stylised face. And here she is today. She's much more cat-shaped, but she still has an expressive face. The game features hacking, so there was a challenge. How does a cat hack? On the left, the model from the prototype just wasn't able to reach desk height and interact with the keyboard. Repositioning the joints helped a bit, but a model rework was called for. On the right, Mittens is able to finally hack. And here's the animation. Please forgive her hitting the return key over and over. She is just a cat after all. An important note here. Cats are liquid. They're floppy, compressible, stretchable, impossible creatures. It makes rigging and skinning cats very interesting. And an extension of that first point, cats are very wiggly. Look at all that motion going on, yet the head remains in place. And another important note here is that cats' eyes are amazing. Pupil dilation is key to cats' emotional states. So here's the process. In the model and skeleton phase, there was, and still is, a bit of tweaking going on. I've not yet nailed down the character, which is one of the perils of doing everything yourself when working on your own game, I guess. So as you can see on the right, the approach I've taken for the pupils is to make them joint-based rather than shader-based. This way, I can see how they look in Maya without the need for any special shaders or materials. There are helper joints for flabby areas as well, not just the belly and the neck, but also around the legs. Face joints aren't too complicated. There are a pair of joints for the mouth corners, and the muzzle acts as a parent for the jowls, nose and whiskers. I'm using simple translatable joints for the eyelids as they're a bit more flexible than having them rotate around the eyeball. The ears are a bit more involved. Initially I just had a single joint chain up each ear, but the ear corners collapsed when trying to get into airplane ears position. Now, as you can see on the right, I have additional joints for the corners. So here's my requirements for animating a cat. Flexible for liquidity, expressive for adorableness, fast to use because making games is hard, suitable for realistic animations as well as stylized animations, and crucially, the scripts need to be able to reapply animation curves to the rig controls based on the baked-down, non-rigged animation of the underlying skeleton. That last point is very important. The key aspect to work around is that the joints should be able to dictate the rig controls as much as the rig controls can affect the joints, meaning that traditional rigging tricks like a value for how much the foot rolls from toes to heel are not suitable. It would be impossible to know just from the baked joint animation alone whether the foot was positioned that way through control rotations or through that foot roll value. So that's thrown out. Cats walk on the balls of their feet anyway, so it's not a particular issue. The animation restore process works based on frame -1 holding the original pose, so any offset information in skeleton changes can be taken into account. This is a very important step. I make sure this -1 key is set every time I make a new animation. The eyes are a little bit special case here. I won't be supporting direct rotation of the eyeballs, just target look at, so I can digest the baked eye rotation onto a spatial position and bake that back onto the rig. It'll be a custom process rather than using the same baking process the rest of the rig will use, but it's an important one to maintain. The rig is stored in the script file as individual modules. The individual limbs, the spine, the tail, the face, and I keep the pelvis and skeleton joint, root joint, also known as trajectory joint, discrete, as they don't need to change spaces like the other parts. Each of these groups can be individually changed from FK to IK or from world space to local space if they support that particular setting. I'll specify what settings each group supports in the script, which I'll cover shortly. Before we continue though, I should clarify some terms so we're all on the same page. FK means forward kinematics, which is the basic way of animating something like a limb. You rotate the shoulder, say, and the elbow and wrist are moved because they are a child of the shoulder. IK means inverse kinematics, most often used for legs because you can set the foot position on the floor, and the joints up the chain, the hip and the knee in this case, will rotate so that the foot, the child, will be in the right place. World and local space are best treated as a pair. Especially if something is a child of something else, it can be thought of as being in its parent's space. So like how in the FK example where rotating the shoulder affects the elbow and the wrist, this is because they are children, and this is because their children are in shoulder space, as it were. The opposite of this setting is to set something to world space. This means that even though it may be a child of something else, it considers itself unrelated and doesn't change position or rotation based on its parent. Now aim space is the special source of this rigging approach. The positions of the joints are entirely non-hierarchical and can be moved as the animator desires, but the rotations are driven by aim constraints, so that they aim at their child. We'll get into that in a second. First, let's take a look at the rig to help illustrate these different spaces. Here we can see the eye controls in local space. They can be moved around freely, but when the head moves, they act as if they're a child of the head. If I change the eye controls to world space, you can see how changes to the head rotation do not affect the position of the eye controls. The orientation matches the head to avoid making the cat go cross-eyed. Now with the legs, they are currently set to World Space IK mode, so when I pull the cat's body down, the feet stay planted to the floor. If I change them to FK mode, they no longer bend, as would be expected of FK controls. But when I rotate the cat's body, the legs stay pointing straight down. This is because the legs are in world space, they stay rooted to the body, but they ignore the body's orientation. Changing the limbs to local space results in the orientation matching that of the body. The eyes rig is a relatively straightforward look-at target. Each eye looks at a child of the main eye rig controller, allowing the cat to converge or diverge focus as needed. These child controls can be rotated to affect pupil dilation, both horizontally and vertically. While we talk about the eye rig, let's also cover some of the tricks used for the face controls and elsewhere. There are a few areas, such as the ears and the mouth corners, where I want animation data to be driven by other joints, but to still be able to be tweaked to tweak the positions. For situations like these, I use driven controls. These are pretty common in rigs. Naughty Dog, among many other studios, use driven controls in areas such as the shoulders, where mass can easily collapse and look unrealistic if there aren't enough joints. I've implemented a few styles of driven joints depending on the situation. For areas like the belly and the neck scruff, I use a midpoint between two other joints to smooth out any harsh poses. For situations like the limbs and the mouth corners, I use a hinge system so that the control arcs around nicely as its driving joints rotate. And for the ear corners, I use an aim system so that they keep the edges of the ear pointing at the tip. In all the situations, the driven constraint system is applied to a parent of the control so that I can animate the control and let it be affected by the driven system in parallel. It's time for a video. Here we see the pupils in action. Rotating in Y changes the width of the pupils, and rotating in Z affects the height. You can get some really nice cat-like pupil shapes. For the majority of the face controls, there is no driven system. The eyelids are just translatable joints. I found that rigging complexity here was more trouble than it was worth. The muzzle control is parent to the jowls and the whiskers. This allows some nice emotive meowing and snarling, and gives the face a nice fleshy feel. Here we see the mouth corners working with a hinge setup. They smooth out the mouth shape by default and can be animated for further tweaking. We also have a nice long flexible cat tongue, which is good for licking bums. The nose and the jowls are suitable for up-close animation. Here we have the ears, with the aim controls for the corners. Cat's ears are highly mobile and expressive, so being able to rotate them back into airplane mode without the model breaking up is a must. So the script has to construct the controls in a variety of different ways depending on the user settings. For the standard FK chains on things like the spine, the tail and the limbs, it's simply a case of creating a group to maintain the offset from the control's parent. Each joint in the skeleton will be constrained to its corresponding control, not just the orientation, but point constrained to allow stretching of the character. As I said before, cats are liquid. For IK limbs, there's a bit more of a complex setup. The knee needs a pole vector, which I have made be a child of the foot control to keep the knees pointing in the same direction as the feet by default. The cat's lower leg is a reverse IK control, allowing more flexibility in the double knee limb. We'll see this in action shortly. A key point here is that the foot plane visual sits on the ground plane at rest, but the foot control pivot does not. It matches the position of the foot joint, which is slightly up from the floor plane. This is to ensure that any baked animation data on the skeleton is directly mappable to the IK controller without any positional offset issues. World and local space mode both affect the top level of the control groups, but in different ways. Local space uses a parent constraint so that the control group acts as if it was a child of whatever is driving it, such as the pelvis for the back legs or the chest for the front legs. World space uses a point constraint so that the control group is pinned in space to the driver but stays oriented to the world. The IK limbs are a little bit more complex in their setup. In local space, the entire group is parent constrained, whereas in world space, only the hip control is parent constrained, allowing the rest of the controls to remain static in space. Aim space is more complex, as we will see. But first, let's take a look at the hind leg IK. Here we see the knee pole vector control. And this is the foot control, with ankle and toe controls as children. The lower leg rotation control allows the leg to compress nicely. The skinning helper control for the hip helps to maintain weight and flabbiness, and the hip origin itself can be moved around for those times when extra reach is needed. Right, aim space. This is the stuff that really impressed me from Richard Lico's work. The concept here is that the control positions become unhierarchical. They can be moved freely independent of each other. What this gives the animator is flexibility and control. It eliminates one of the main time sinks in animation, counter-keying motion. Here's how the rigging works. Whereas in normal situations, the joints of the skeleton are point and orient constrained to the corresponding rig control, in aim space, the joint is aim constrained to its child joint, with the controller as up vector object. This means that moving the controller for, say, the chest, will reposition the body without affecting the head. No need to counter-key anything anymore. We can point constrain the joint to its controller to allow stretchy mode, but while this is great for the spine, it's not so good for the tail, so it can be enabled or disabled as required. Let's see it in action. So here we see the spine in local space. Rotating controls affect the children as you'd expect, as does translating. Now I swap into aim space mode. Rotating the control doesn't affect the model much, but translating it certainly does. This workflow is best used to layer pose improvements on top of existing animation, rather than for animating from scratch. So this is the process for animating with the rig. I'll go through this stuff with visual examples first, then I'll deep dive into the rigging script after, so you have a bit of context on what is going on in the Maya scene. So, if working on a new animation, I bring in the character file, just the model and the skeleton. I apply the rig I need. If I'm making an animation from scratch, it will most likely be set to world space with IK limbs. I set a keyframe on the entire rig in the original pose on frame -1. I block out the animation. I get the motion feeling right. I do some splining and breakdowns to get the general sense of weight working. Then I change the rig, primarily the spine, to aim space, and I can get tweaky with the poses, add some nice bouncy secondary animation. Then if I want to work on it some more in FK mode, I can reapply that set of controls and continue animating. The best approach here is to make the animation changes as additive animation layer on top of the current motion. I export it to the game and check to see if any more tweaking is needed. If not, that's great. Next animation, please. At this point, Richard Lico closes Maya without saving. I can't bring myself to take that extra step, so I save the Maya file. If I need to work on an existing animation and the skeleton has changed, I'll bake the anim from the old skeleton, bring in the new one, make a rig, restore the animation, and I'm away. So let's see the rig in action. Here I have an idle, but I haven't worked on the tail yet. I only have it animating at the base with no flexibility down the tail. I could go down each control and rotate them to mimic that swishy cattail motion that I want, or I can just convert this simple animation to aim space. This means I can just put a little delay on the keyframes, more the further down the tail the control sits, and hey presto, the tail wags. If it's not enough, I can just push it a little further for extra curl and slink. That's great, but what about if I have an animation where the cat is near a wall and the tail is going through? If I was animating with a normal rig, this would involve a ton of counter keying and tweaking. In AimSpace, I can see the exact position of each control in their keys, so I can just make sure that controls never move through the wall. I make a locator and position it at the wall to get the translation value for the wall, then I flatten the translation values for the tail joints that are intersecting. A little bit of tweaking to make sure the model doesn't poke through, and I'm done. This still maintains all the overlapping motion in the core animation. One thing that's important for animating animals, cats in particular, is that the head motion tends to be quite level even during high-speed locomotion. You can see here the tiger's head isn't bouncing around as much as the rest of the body. So here I have a gallop. It looks good, but what if I want to level out that head motion a little? With a normal FK rig, I'd need to tweak the animation of the controls up the spine to keep the head level, a process known as counter keying. It's not fun or productive. It's much easier when working in AimSpace. Here I am making an animation layer for the head and head look controls. I've set it to override mode rather than additive, which means I can easily flatten out the head movement. I'm setting a key for the head only at the extent of its motion. This means any jittering that may happen in between will be smoothed over. Similar to with the tail wagging against the wall, I'm taking the up and down animation data and scaling it flat to remove the bounce. Now I can change the strength of this animation layer to get the bounce amount that I want. Full strength for totally flat, 0 strength for totally bouncy, and half strength for just the right amount of bounce. And not a single bit of counter keying was involved. One last example before we get into the scripts. Here I have a flop down and sleep animation in a rough state. There's no particular bounce or nice motion going on. Again, if I wanted to get some lovely overlap on the body and tail and I was working in FK, it would involve a ton of back and forth, tweaking the controls to get the motion just right. However, I can use the same technique I used for the tail wag earlier, change over to AimSpace, and all I need to do is push the animation data for the controls later and later as I go down the chain. I can even delay the animation of the head look control later than the head to get the head to lag and bounce as the cat flops down. And there it is, essentially free overlapping animation. So, we've seen how the rig works. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the script. This will get pretty technical for a while, but I'll have some good, nice, cute cat animations at the end, so it'll all be worth it. Essentially, I have a shelf button which imports the script into memory, which I click on when I open Maya. Then there are bake and restore buttons. The bake will create a series of locators, one for each joint in the skeleton in the scene, and bake the position and rotation animation data out. I call this the anim cache. The restore button will find what kind of controls the current rig has and look for corresponding locators in the anim cache. If it finds them, it constrains the controls to the locators and bakes the animation. This pair of buttons is ideal if I've updated the cat's model or skeleton. I load up the anim on the old model, bake the anim cache, delete the old model, load in the new model, apply a rig, and restore the animation. The next few buttons are for creating rigs in world space mode, local space mode, or aim space mode. This is for starting a new animation or updating an existing animation to a new skeleton. The next set of buttons after that are relatively complex. They will take whatever controls are selected, work out what bone groups they belong to, and reconstruct those controls with new space, stretch, or control settings. While they do this, they also bake and restore the animation for those control groups. So if I'm working on the spine in local space and I want to change to aim space, I select one of the spine controls and press to aim. When Maya has finished processing, I have the exact same animation as before, but now I can pull the spine controls around instead of rotating them. Similarly, if I select controls from the front two legs, I can change them from IK to FK at the click of a button, which is great for tweaking things like the running paw motion when it's in the air. Before I go any further, I want to talk about making rigs and writing mel code. Here we have the hind leg pole vector control. It's a wireframe sphere. The rig script creates this from scratch. How does it do that? Well, it runs a command called circle, which creates a circle object. Here's the code to make a circle. There are bits in here that start with $signs, like name. These are variables. We'll not worry about that for now. All the bits after the word circle that start with a dash are parameters for the circle. Let's quickly have a look at them. As you can see, there's a lot of information here. But how do I know all this? The online command reference. It really is as simple as going to that web page and searching for the command to find out what it does. How did I learn what commands to search for in the command reference in the first place? The script editor. Whenever you do something in Maya, the commands that Maya runs are listed in the script editor. This is how you can go about writing your own scripts to automate your workflow. Find yourself doing something trivial over and over? Look in the script editor, find out the command or commands, and write a little script that will do it for you. Then you can put it on a shelf button and save yourself a ton of time. As a quick digression, this is how you take a circle and make a sphere out of it. You actually use 3 circles, and you stack their shape nodes up under one object node. This is a common trick for making controls for rigs in Maya, so screen grab this page now if you like, or you can Google it later at your leisure. We're about to get into a bunch of scripting, so first let's have a quick cat break. This is Hugo. He's Abandoned Sheep's Chief Technical Officer. His technical knowledge is a little lacking, but he makes up for it by being a really great source of reference footage for cats. So, let's go through what the scripts are doing. I'll have some detail on the slides that I won't talk through in the interest of brevity, but the slides will be available if you want to read deeper into what's going on. At the core, I have the list of joints that make up the character skeleton. If I make changes to the skeleton, I have to reflect that in the list of joints in my rigging scripts. The list of joints is split up by control group into arrays of strings. So the left hind leg is one string array, the right hind leg is another string array. The strings themselves contain all the data required to construct the controls for that joint. Each element in the string is separated by a space. So in that first bold example, it says that the left shoulder has the left clavicle as its parent, and the control size is 24, with a control offset of 0. Offset is used to push the control visual out for things like jaw controls. As you can see, a lot of elements don't need to be included, such as driven controls. Per control group, I specify what styles, as in FK or IK, and spaces, as in local, world, or aim, they will support. The first entry in the list of styles and spaces is treated as default. And for stretch mode, they can be set to 0 meaning never, 1 meaning either, or 2 meaning always. Face is set to always, the rest are left on either. The rig creator script takes in a list of bone groups and optionally settings for style, space, and stretch. If these optional settings aren't present, the creator uses each bone group's default settings. The current frame is set to -1 so that the skeleton will be in the original pose, aka the bind pose. For each of the bone groups in the list, a check is made to see if those controls exist. If they don't, they will be created. If they do, they are checked to make sure they match the specified style, space, or stretch settings. If they don't match, they will be recreated. If the skeleton has keys on it, the entire skeleton is baked into the anim cache. If not, the rig controls that will be recreated are checked for keyframe information, and if there is any, that is baked into the cache. This way, if there's no animation data to store, the process is much quicker. The creator makes the various control groups in ways that I will detail next, then the animation data is restored. Something I do that helps converting from control type to control type is to store information about the rig controls in the rig root as hidden attributes. I store the controls for each group in a string with the controls separated by whitespace. I can use this to get the control names in the right order if I want to restore animation from the anim cache. I also store their current settings for style, space and stretch, and the rig changing process uses this to know whether to recreate the control groups. Here's a little information on the store animation process. The bone list array is the name of each bone group, like spine, face, hind leg, that I want to store. Each time the store animation script is called, it deletes the existing anim cache to start from scratch. For each bone that is being stored, a locator is created which is point and orient constrained to the joint to match its position. Once all the locators are constrained, I bake their animation, making sure the timeline is set to start on frame -1. Finally, I delete all relatives of the locators to get rid of the now useless constraints. The restore process is structured similarly, again starting with the list of bone groups to restore from the cache. Remember when I said I stored hidden attributes on the rig root for the rig controls? This is where that information is used. For each of the bone groups that are about to be restored, I check with the rig root to see what space, style, and stretch mode the controls are in. I also get a list of control names by tokenizing the long string of controls, using whitespace to separate the long string into individual short strings, one per control. Two complementary lists of names are created, one for the rig controls and one for the corresponding locator in the anim cache. For each pair in this list, the control is point and orient constrained to the locator. If the control has locked translate channels, which the rig creator script will do in situations such as where stretch is disabled, the control is only orient constrained, not point constrained. I wrote a helper script for constraining objects, which can deal with locked channels and different styles of constraining. Details on that next. If the eyes are being restored, a separate process is called, which I will detail shortly. Once all this constraining is finished, the timeline is set to start at -1, the rig controls are baked, and the constraints are deleted. However, unlike with the anim cache, I can't just delete relatives, because some of the rig controls may have children, so I have to store the names of the constraints as they are created, and delete them by name at the end. Here's some information about the helper script I use for constraining. Basically, it takes in two objects, the thing being constrained and what it's being constrained to. It also takes in the constraint types as a series of single characters in a string, allowing point and orient constraining to happen at once. If offset is set to -1, the constrained object won't be forced to match the driving object, but will be affected from where it currently is. Once the whole process is finished, it returns the name of the constraints, which is what the restore process uses to build up a list of constraints to delete at the end. The creation process for controls is basically the same regardless if it's FK, IK, aim space or local space or world space. The first thing to do is make the control using the circle or sphere technique I mentioned earlier. Then we create an empty group and make this control its child. Now we can position the group to match the joint so that the control will be in the right position and space orientation, but the control itself will have 0 transform channels, which allows us to easily get back to the original pose. All these controls should be collected together in a parent main control group. The parent of the control group is constrained as required based on its space settings. Local space requires point and orient constraining. World space requires parent constraining, with additional orient constraining to the rig root to override the parent's orientation. Aim space doesn't have any constraining. Let's look at how the iRig is created. The iRig is made up of a master control and 2 child controls, one for each eye. In the skeleton, each eyeball joint is aim constrained to look at its pertinent eye controller. Each set of pupil joints have driven keys applied, connecting the rotation of the child eye controls with the joint's rotation and scale channels. Making the pupil narrower involves rotating the joints on the left and right and scaling the joints at the top and the bottom in width to maintain an oval shape. This is the only area where the controls in the rig do not match the joints in the skeleton, so I'll quickly dip into the iRig restore animation process. The anim cache bake process creates 2 free-floating locators, each one positioned in front of an eye. This positional data is used to reconstruct the aim control's spatial position. The rotation channels of these free-floating locators is used to store the rotation data of the pupil joints, a direct mapping of the width and height of the pupil. The restore process will take these free-floating locators and position the main eye look-at controls in between the two. This is a best guess at where the control was initially positioned. The pupil controls are rotated based on the anim cache rotation data to restore the pupil dilation animation. So, for FK joint chains, this is the process. The string list this time is the actual joints, not just the control groups, because this process happens per bone group. The parent string is the name of the control group, however, and it's used to decipher the name of the group to parent the controls to, with _FK as a suffix because this process is specific to the FK controls. The skeleton is sent to the bind pose and any constraints are temporarily disabled using the do enable node items false command. An important part of this process is to create all the controls and position them in one pass, then to constrain the skeleton to the controls in a second pass. This avoids inconsistency in skeleton posing that can occur if the joints are constrained up before the control of a child joint is positioned. The controls are created and positioned as in the previous slide, and once all are created, each joint is constrained to its control. Point and orient constrained if stretchy, or if not stretchy, just orient constrained, with the translate channels locked. If it is a driven control, there is a separate process for dealing with the drivers. This FK chain process also handles aim space chains, but with a few differences. Instead of parenting each control's offset group to its direct parent, they are all parented to the control group itself, meaning that there is a flat hierarchy to the controls. And instead of point and orient constraining the joint to its own control, the parent joint of this control's joint is aim constrained to this control, using the parent control as up vector object. This is the magic bit. This is what allows the stretchy, tweaky, easy animation process that makes the whole system such a joy to work with. If this chain is in stretchy mode, the point constraining works as in the standard FK mode. For the IK, specifically the Hind IK here, it's another custom process. The main points here are that there are two IK handles at play, one going from the hip to the ankle, and in cats the ankle is the backwards knee as it were, not down by the foot, and then one going from the ankle to the foot. This allows the stretchy, compressy back leg control that cats need. There's a pole vector control for the knee to aim at, and some rotation controls for the toe and the lower flexible bit around the foot. It's sort of the ankle, but not really. The hip itself has a controller. You wouldn't see this in a human leg rig IK, because the rotation of the hips is controlled by the IK handle, and hips don't generally translate unless there's something wrong with you medically. But the whole cat's eye liquid thing means that it's sometimes handy to be able to translate the origin of the back leg around for extra stretch or squash on some poses. When Mitten hacks a computer, the hips translate a little bit to give her extra height. Once all the controls are made, the joints are constrained. The IK legs feature a few helper controls. Just like in the FK chain, the helper controls are created in a separate process. Let's take a look at that before calling it a day on the scripts. Each control in the rig is the child of an offset group. The offset group is positioned at the joint in question. It allows the control to be at rest, rotation and translation values of 0, at the arbitrary joint position in space. Driven controls have another parent group, a space group, which is constrained up to other joints in the skeleton. And because this parent group is dynamic, changing rotation and translation based on other joints, a lot of the animator's work is performed automatically, but the animator can also tweak that automatic motion because the control is available to be moved and keyed. There are three types of driven control: hinge, aim, and midpoint. Hinge is good for things that act like hinges. The jaw and the knees are both areas that hinge open, so this is a great driver method for the mouth corners and the fleshy bits at the back of the legs. The hinge driver setup involves point constraining the space group to both of the driver joints so that it moves to the midpoint between them. It is also aimed at one of the drivers so that its orientation changes with the opening and closing action. Midpoint is the same as hinge but without the aim constraint so that it maintains its own orientation. And finally, aim is a relatively simple aim constraint setup, making use of a driver object as up vector so that no nasty unexpected rotations happen. And that's it. There is much more lurking in my scripts folder than what I've just gone through, but the point here is to give you the entry point to this process. When I started this rigging process, there were no driven controls, no pupil dilation iRig, no fancy double knee eye case system. I started with the basics: make a control, make an offset group, position them at the joint, constrain the joint. I made it by hand first, then I copied the result from the script window, then I compiled them all into a script, and slowly that script grew and grew. That's the way to go with a system like this. Build it up in chunks, make it usable at all stages, and add extra functions to it when they become desirable. Anyway, that was a lot of text. Let's finish with something a bit more fun. I wanted to perform some tests on the character rig and skinning to make sure it would accommodate all the various positions a cat can adopt. To that end, I took the opportunity to reenact a few famous moments from internet history, be they cat-based or otherwise. And so, Mittens Meme Monday was born. Here we have a piece called Angry Woman Points at Salad-Eating Cat. This was an excellent test of facial expressions, managing to capture that feline disdain. Meanwhile, Strange Muscle Cat by a Step here was an excellent opportunity to squash and stretch the rig to its extremes. As you can see in the behind-the-scenes side view, this was perhaps a squatch too far. Stop filming and get me out of this mess here helped show up where some of the flabby bits of the front legs might intersect. And that's another good bit of emoting from Mittens. Going for a tug on the heartstrings is The Loneliest Birthday. Prime points of interest are the back legs and how the flabby bits settle around the foot when Mittens is in a sitting position. Honestly, there wasn't much of a rig test in this one, but it's a pretty cute shot. Here we have a moving test in which Mittens is, well, she just vibing. The animation here was all produced in aim space, which allowed rotoscoping with the source footage to be pretty exact. This one is admittedly not particularly accurate to the source material, but it was a good opportunity to get some nice overlapping motion on the paws. And I'm sure we all saw the lawyer who accidentally activated the cat filter on Zoom. I managed to get this animation turned out the same day, animating it first in FK mode, then swapping to aim space to tweak the body and head positions.
Mr. Ponton, I believe you have a filter turned on in the video settings. You might want to take
we're trying to. Can you hear me, Judge?
I can hear you. I think it's a filter.
It is, and I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here. She's trying to, but I'm prepared to go forward with it. I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
I can see that.
So let's sum up. Pose switching is powerful. It's fast. It improves animation quality, and it's easy to work with. But there is a significant time investment required, and the scripts you will need to write will be custom to your approach. There is no off-the-shelf scripting solution yet. I believe Unity has started looking into implementing an animation system like this, but Unity features tend to take a not insignificant time to become usable. On the right are the links that I mentioned during the talk. If you want to screen capture the slide and add them to your bookmarks, do it now. Again, I owe this talk to Richard Lico's work. Go check out Animation Sherpa. But for now, I believe we have time for a few questions, so get typing. Thank you.